evening, wherever you may be in the world. This is Carla from Rehan Allahwala's World of Connections, and I am here to speak with Jack Austin, an old friend of Rehan's and also someone who has worked with him much before I ever came into the fold. And he's going to tell us about his life, his work, and his passions. And I'm really anxious to get to know him. And having said that, I want to remind you that this show, like all of my shows, is sponsored by the Institute of Peace, which is an online organization promoting peace one conversation at a time. Jack, will you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Carla. So I am a second generation Californian, which is kind of uncommon these days. And so I was born and raised in Southern California and did my schooling in Texas, though. So when it came to college, that's where I went to school in San Antonio, Texas, and lived there for about 20 years. So I've had a little bit of experience outside of the States and, you know, a bit of travel around the world in the UK and so forth. But Rehan and I came into contact around 2007, and then much later we actually started to get to know each other a little bit around 2012. And it is a very diverse world that he occupies, without a doubt, and very cutting edge in a lot of the technological things that he's involved in. And the entrepreneurial aspect of that is one of the things that connected us. So I've met him twice in the United States when he's been on various trips, and have, you know, enjoyed connecting with him. The thing that we have in common that goes to my own personal experience is around what I would call conscious business. And so this would be like conscious capitalism, founded in the same roots. And the fundamental idea is that a lot of capitalistic activities have produced significant benefit to the world from the standpoint of how much wealth has been created for a lot of people. But the current form of that, the non-conscious form, has a lot of downside as well. There's exploitation, there's use of non-sustainable resources, and there's a lot of other challenges that come with it. And in 2007, I saw Bob Geldof speak in Scotland, and that was kind of a bit of a turning point for me from the standpoint of what was possible. Prior to that, I'd had a career in the corporate world, and I'd been a general manager for a company and for 16 years, had run multiple teams, and had numerous successes with more conscious approaches, using the work of Stephen Covey, Blanchard, Tony Robbins, and a variety of other people that I've worked with, such as Richard Bandler and John Grinder, NLP. But the thing that I noticed was most powerful was that the old-fashioned approach of being critical and hierarchical really didn't work that well. And the company that I was working for at the time had been set up by a bunch of naval folks. So it was very process oriented and very, very process dominant, and it was very hierarchical in structure. And those characteristics were keeping us from being able to make the transitions necessary to keep up with the market. And so I had an experience of a 40-plus-year-old company remaking itself and being an integral part of that in a local market, and basically helping the company share a new value system that had been formally spoken mission statement, vision statement, values, orientation, principles, standard, and sort of a principle-centered leadership approach being brought to the fore. And what I got was not only a richer personal experience, but highly motivated people who were working, who felt much freer to be able to do their very best and to take a sense of ownership, because they weren't being treated as though they were merely warm bodies trying to fill empty spots. And that was very inspiring. As recently as 2019, I found out that some of those folks took that experience so strongly that I even had a child named after me. And it's not so much about that it was me, but you don't ever name a child after your worst boss. Just something you just don't seem to do. And it was a person that I really admired for their work ethic, their human connection, their strength of performance, and just all around beautiful human being. And when I found that out, I mean, it just filled my eyes with tears. I couldn't believe it, because she died unexpectedly, which is why I was told about this in the first place. So what I do, right? What I do typically is I work with private clients, and they're typically men between the ages of 35 and 55 with business experience, typically business owners, and they're new fathers typically. And what they're having is a challenge experiencing the same level of success that they'd experienced previously, with all of the new array of activities that are going on when they have a fully burgeoning family and children and things to make room for in their lives. And I help them get refocused and have the business take less of an important spot. They can't do the same approach that they had done previously with the business, or it dominates the family life. And they can't necessarily focus only on family, because the business won't take care of itself. So there's a balancing point, and I help show them what that is and get over any of their internal issues that might stop them from doing that. Childhood traumas and things of that nature. So that's kind of where I've gone in my work, and it shows up with highly motivated and purpose-driven business owners who have fantastic relationships with their children. And since that wasn't specifically my personal experience in life, it's extraordinarily rewarding to see it, because there's nothing quite like it when there's true deep admiration on both parties, of fathers for their children and children for their father. Certainly not untrue of children for their mother, but the relationship typically isn't the same. It's a very different kind of relationship between a father and their children and a mother and their children. So plus women have a little bit more permission to do emotional work and to pay attention to these things instead of just tough it out and pretend like they're made of steel or something. An approach that I found particularly doesn't work, and it is very traditional. Certainly it's been traditional in the UK and the English speaking world. So one of the areas that I've paid attention to for over a decade is a focus on the human value system as it is related to the dynamics of individual change, family change, business change, and world change. And I had a mentor who was actually involved with Nelson Mandela and the changes that occurred in South Africa, and was instrumental there for more than 13 years, giving direct in-country guidance and consultation to both businesses and the government. And a lot of things just aren't the way they appear to be on the surface, as perhaps I'm sure you've recognized in your own life, Carla.
Oh, yeah. I love to see men involved with their kids. I think it's important. How do you get men to all of a sudden decide, I'm going to be involved? I'm not going to just put the kids to the side?
Well, it up to this point, it's been a very specific type of client, but I think that there's a greater opening to this at this current time. For a moment there, we shared a little bit about how the pandemic has affected things. And one of the things that's happened is a lot of people have had some reflection time that they had not ever had necessarily before. With some of the lockdowns, people were, very restricted in their ability to move about in different states and different countries. And one of the things that has also come up is the proximity of relationship. China had a huge increase in the amount of divorces, greater than any other time in the country's history after their first lockdown. And so any place where there's a stress tends to either be a great opportunity for healing or a place for tremendous conflict. And my personal belief is they're both simultaneously available. But of course, that isn't how people view things when they're coming from the survival instinct of the ego. And that's a whole conversation in and of itself. One of the things that I've seen in my work, which does, I pay attention to a lot of neurobiology and neuroscience. And the majority of people that I encounter are at some stage of fight or flight most of the time during the day. It's a reactive state of mind. And that doesn't mean they don't have their responsibilities taken care of. It's just the way they're doing it is to ward off danger. They're trying to protect themselves against things turning bad, problems happening. There's a lack of relaxed breathing. There's a lack of relaxed musculature. And so in the United States, we're one of the most medicated societies in the world. There's a lot of repressed emotion, and that shows up with the use of medications, over-the-counter, prescribed alcohol use, things of that nature. And a lot of this is subconscious. People are just not aware that the idea that there's a mind-body connection is an actual falsehood, because there's no separation. It's not that there is just a connection, they're one. The mind and the body are all part of one thing. And Western medicine and Western society has typically separated the two as though they were somehow different. And that creates a huge number of challenges in people's behavior and the way they perceive the world. And from my experience, it creates a lot of challenges that don't need to exist.
So how can we turn this around? Are you into neuro-linguistic programming?
I'm certified as a master practitioner of neurolinguistic programming.
So how?
Twice, actually.
I'm just beginning to understand that now. How are you using that to help you navigate and help other men accept responsibility for their kids?
Well, it doesn't start there. See, one of the challenges that we have in this society is that we don't take responsibility for our own lives at the most comprehensive metaphysical level, because that's really, there's a famous philosopher from the French Catholic Church called Teilhard de Chardin. And one of his more famous quotes is that we are not human beings having a spiritual experience, but spiritual beings having a physical experience. And my life experience has borne that out. I believe that is absolutely, without a doubt, true. I have a degree in philosophy, and I thought the philosophy had the answers. What I found was that philosophy had a lot of people with a bunch of opinions and a lot of theories, but not necessarily comprehensive answers. So there were some more um, philosophically approached problems from the standpoint of inquiry that were useful for human experience. And certainly, I think Plato had something that's come down to us, which is known as the myth of the cave. And essentially, what he described was people being fascinated by the shadows on the wall that were thrown by the light of a fire. But they were mistaking the shadows on the wall for the actual thing itself. And one of the fundamental misunderstandings I think that people have is that we don't have direct experience of life, physical things or touch. Everything's processed through the brain. Everything is processed through the neurological system. And so the closest thing to direct experience we have is consciousness itself, because it doesn't have something that processes it. Though there are experiences we have which are so realistic, because we have essentially the greatest special effects system in the universe, the human awareness system, the human consciousness. In the brain and the neurology, that gives us the impression that things in the outside world are more real than things in the inside world. When, as Carl Jung once wrote, as long as we keep the things in our unconscious out of our awareness, life will happen to us, and we will call it destiny. Mm. So essentially what it comes down to is the awakening process, which is something that we all are equipped for. It's part of our native facility and the way that the brain is made up and the way that consciousness is structured. We can all wake up to the fact that we have more responsibility for what happens in our lives than we will often give credit to. So back when I started using some of these ideas with staff members, I had a hostess we hired at the age of 16, who is now an attorney representing abused children for the county of Riverside in Southern California. And she wrote me a note one time thanking me for the leadership training. And what I was doing was I was modifying the company's training, which was generic and valued, with very specific things about personal responsibility and personal behavior that I'd witnessed in that business for having been involved in the industry for decades. And one of those things is talked about by Stephen Covey in his book, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, right? Which is his code word essentially for success. He could have sold more books, but he didn't want to use that word because he felt it was contaminated by the societal belief of what is success. Effectiveness, on the other hand, is something that's measurable, and it's not efficiency. It's something greater than mere efficiency. It's both efficiency and proactive, connected, emotional intelligence, and utilizes scientific principles. But the point that I'm getting at is that he uses the quote from a famous psychotherapist, a man by the name of Viktor Frankl, who wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. He also founded a school of psychology called logotherapy. And logotherapy was essentially an existential psychotherapeutic approach that leaned heavily on his training as a Freudian psychotherapist, but more heavily on his personal experience in Auschwitz and Belsen, where he was a prisoner during the Holocaust. And his entire family was killed, murdered by the Germans, the Nazis. And he had a very simple statement, and that was, between stimulus and response, there is a small gap, and that's for choice. And what I shared with my people was the fact that they had the ability as humans, without any other training, to widen that gap. So that when a stimulus came into their environment, they had the opportunity to make a decision whether or not they were going to respond to it, react to it, or ignore it. And that it had a lot to do with interactions under heated, experiences. In the environment, you could have a lot of people waiting for things at different times. You could have people under stress that you would be working with who wouldn't necessarily be behaving in the most responsible fashion. And things only get worse when both parties play that game of not taking charge of their own feelings and emotions. And I've actually had people from JPL argue with me that you cannot teach responsibility. And I've witnessed that it's specifically something that we already have that's easily activated within a human being once you actually speak to them in a connected way.
Changing the thought patterns of someone is not an easy thing. I've been kind of working with someone with NLP very positively. And we got to a point where I needed to see some negativity. We're not going to go into details. Mm-hmm. But the point is that I felt it can go back to birth. And knowing that, how can NLP help someone to change their thinking process?
Well, one of the things people are commonly not aware of is the fact that we're going in and out of trance all day long. And then sleep is another trance. If you use the biological markers for that, the alpha, beta, delta levels of brainwaves. And one of the ways that we activate specific trances, which could be called patterns, is through our language. A lot of times a behavior or a set of words will be spoken and it'll activate something. If you change how you process those words, or if you change the neurological connection, in other words, if you deactivate a charge in the system, a person won't respond the same way that they responded before, which usually gives them that beginning of the gap to have a better response and to take better charge. So though it's not easy, it is very doable. There is an actual thing that I've seen that holds a lot of hope for me. There is a body of work called Three Principles, and it came about as a consequence of an enlightenment experience of an individual in Vancouver, British Columbia, a place called Saltwater Creek Island. It fell over the name of Sid Banks. But what Sid discovered was that he had been under the assumption of the world happening to him rather than from him. Now, there's a when mentioning that model, which sounds a little abstract probably, most people are under the belief that, which at some level is a victim state, that the world's happening to them. One of the first stages of what might be referred to as growing up work in personal development or Western psychological development is the world happens for them. And that third stage is more actually a spiritual awareness stage, a stage in something that's referred to as awakening. And it's actually that the world's happening from us. I'm not sure, Carla, if you've ever heard this phrase, but we teach people how to treat us. And there's an implication from that phrase that somehow our language or our behavior or our state of being is giving indicators and cues to other people about how we should be treated. Well, and that's absolutely true to my experience. I've seen that happen. I've done that myself. There's another stage at which that occurs, which is if we wake up to who we truly are, the actual spiritual being that we are, not the personality or persona of made up characteristics of limitations, very associated with the ego construct and the body and so forth, and all of our beliefs and historical memories and so forth. There's a tremendous opening for people to shift and have a very profound new awareness of peace and of acceptance of all things in life, which reduces struggle, reduces resistance. And it's not, resistance against evil, it's resistance of life itself. So I'm not sure if you've ever heard of a particular teacher by the name of Byron Katie, but she wrote a book, a very New York Times best-selling book called Love What Is. And her particular work came about as a consequence of her grappling with an addiction experience and a personal bottom, where she had reached a place in her experience where she wasn't having the ability to control her life in any meaningful way, and things were out of control and collapsing around her. And she had an epiphany, and so has something called the 4 questions, which basically is an inquiry of life. And it is it true? Is it really true? How do you know it's true? And what would it be like if it wasn't true? In my experience of those questions, when asked in genuine clarity and authentic inquiry, is that there's very little that people get upset about that they can actually know is really true. They get upset about all kinds of things which are actually concepts in their mind and conclusions that they've drawn based on historical experience, and they're not necessarily experiencing direct experience. So a neighbor said so and such, or so and so betrayed me, or because such and such did this and that, I'm upset. All of which is just made up. It's a tempest in a teapot. None of that is actually happening in the world from a knowing place. But people get wound up. They have anxiety attacks and panic attacks over their thoughts. And then they think, because of one of the things that our Western medical approach to unwellness does is looks at the symptoms and then tries to make a diagnosis. And what ends up happening is people think themselves into lots of problems. And that's what Sid Banks discovered when he woke up to his own life experience and then saw what was actually how consciousness actually created his life and how it did so in his own awareness, how it did so for everybody else. And what ended up happening for him is for more than 30 years, he basically transformed people's lives by being with them because he had so much internal peace and wisdom, so much simplicity about his approach that people woke up to their own conscious lives, like just by being around him, just by hearing him speak, just by a few questions. And he absolutely fought against having a religious, religion formed around him and so forth. But these conversations have been had in government housing projects, penitentiaries, counseling environments, social work environments, some of the most intense conflict environments around. And universally, there's been a de-escalation of all the drama challenges that were in those environments previously. There was a housing project in Florida called Modelo that basically went from being a complete shooting gallery that the police wouldn't enter without absolute necessity and an escort of locals, to being a place where drug dealers didn't exist because within 2 years, they didn't have any buyers. Nobody would participate. And it was because the participants in the community, the members of the community, woke up to the fact that they had the ability to influence their own lives and then took charge of that and created their own stores, created their own babysitting environments, childcare. People went back to school, people got jobs, all kinds of things changed, and all in a 2-year period of time without major government influence. It was all conversations led by individuals amongst the community. And people just literally woke up to what they could do and then started doing it. Same thing happened in Oakland in California, and the person who was in charge of security won the California Peace Award. He was a retired peace officer from California Highway Patrol. And he said that it was the community that did it themselves. So they literally, again, had no drug dealers because there was nobody to sell to. And it wasn't because they got better policing. And the community itself, all of the indicators, people went back and got GEDs, people got employed, people created on property schools and homeschooling and childcare and their own store, all because they could, not because of some government-sponsored program. And it all happened spontaneously as a consequence of people waking up to that capacity, which is an innate capacity within all human beings. So the promise that I see with all of the problems that we could focus on in the world, and the way that the news seems to necessarily trigger our fight or flight instincts because of the need to sell newspapers, there's more hope than what people give credit for. And that doesn't deny that there is conflict. It's just a lot of folks are still asleep. A lot of folks are still in old days. And Rehan himself is an influencer in this regard, trying to help Pakistan move forward in the technological age when large portions of the country are still in tribal organization and with a lot of unscientific beliefs that about the way the world works. And there's lots of parts of the world that have some very inaccurate views. that are very traditional. And this creates a lot of conflict when change happens in that way, because people tend to sort of fight for their right to be right until they wake up and realize they don't have to.
Well, it appears to me that the world is as we create it, and there's no need to blame someone for making our world a little weird because we think that way. The world, we create what it is. And I'm becoming really aware of it in the past few months, maybe to the past year. And what I am interested in is if I began creating the world that as I see it now when I was a baby, and I'm saying, hey, this isn't correct. Can it still be changed after so many years of being ingrained, of thinking this is what the world is, but no, it really isn't. The world has actually been created by me and by how I want to see it. I don't know if that question is clear to you.
Well, what I would reflect is the fact that what typically occurs for people in this experience of waking up, right? And I'm not talking about, quote, woke culture and political correctness or anything of that nature. This is a real spiritual enlightenment, or the beginnings of such a process where a person actually gains access to, what might be referred to as universal wisdom, which is always available, but not necessarily accessible based upon the constructs from childhood and so forth, when our egos are structured to deal with other people and the way that the world is perceived. What seems to happen is there's something that precedes the awareness of consciousness. In other words, from a metaphysical standpoint, there's a formless state before there was form. And what seems to occur is the awareness of that formless state, that state that existed prior to the existence of the individual awareness as a self, as an individual self, as a separate being. And what happens as a consequence of that is kind of the sort of change that occurs from meditative awareness of the so-called witness state. When a person can witness their own behaviors that are not highly functional, that are counterproductive, but have been habitually present, they stop becoming useful. They no longer feel compelled to do them. So people will spontaneously stop smoking. People will spontaneously eat differently than they had done previously. And it's all because they have a different level of access to their own sort of intuitive knowing. Because, in a society that can talk about a distinction like mind-body, right, or Cartesian dualism, there's only one function of the brain that does that, and that's the left lobe of the brain. In its operation is basically a serial function. There's a great YouTube video that sort of lays this out in the most humanly accessible way that I've ever seen, by a lady by the name of Jill Bolte Taylor, Bolte Taylor. And she was a Harvard neuroanatomist who woke up one morning and had a headache, but thought she'd just work it out on her cardio glider. And turns out she had a brain aneurysm. And every time the aneurysm expanded, it shut off the access point to her left lobe of her brain. And she went to what she described as la la land. So here's a Harvard neuroanatomist witnessing their own stroke of genius, as she referred to it, because it changed her life and many, many other people's as a consequence of what she learned from that experience. When that left lobe turns off, her capacity to understand language and to speak in language was lost. And what she was aware of was she was a massive, large, bulbous, sort of formless ball of energy that she had a hard time noticing the difference of between other objects or things and herself. She started losing the capacity to notice the difference. And then her left lobe would come back online, and the ego would, shout in her ear, "We got a problem here. We got a real problem here. We need to do something about this." It took her over 9 years of rehabilitation to achieve full recovery and recertifying all of her educational background. But the thing that she learned was that essentially we have a serial processor, right? Something that processes linearly and sequentially in one side of the brain. And on the other side of the brain, the other lobe spends most of its time functioning in a parallel fashion, which is all associational and cross-referencing and about perception. And so one part of the brain is all about detail and more detail and more detail about the detail. And then the other is all about global awareness, connectedness, oneness, and unity, with a profound feeling of peace and wellness about everything in one cranium. And so essentially we hold the keys to peace in our capacity to connect to the various functions within our own brains. If we spent more time, as Gandhi did, meditating, we would have less need for the kinds of conflicts that are so common in our world, whether they be in a courtroom, a family bickering, or countries going to war. All of that's within us to handle.
You perked a question in my mind just now. And I have had two experiences. I meditate every day. I have moments where I feel extreme peace. And then I have moments where I feel, I almost want to strangle someone because I'm feeling that conflict. How do I know which side to stay with? I mean, if I close my eyes or even I take a deep breath, I'll go back to the real peaceful thing. And then I'll wonder, can this be reality? Or should I be on the other side? And I see you smiling, so maybe I'm asking a decent question.
Well, it really is this, right? The concept of an absolute reality doesn't exist. We have 7.5 billion of them, right? There's a reality for every consciousness that exists as a human being on the planet. So it's realities. And the fact of the matter is that, just like the quantum mechanics, subatomic particle physics idea of a multiverse happening simultaneously, that's true. There's, progressively growing evidence of the fact and greater ability to test it and verify it. Essentially, this gets pretty esoteric. This is not Jack marketing himself very well as a practitioner, but I'll talk about it because it's absolutely fascinating to me. There's are you familiar with something called the observer effect?
What? Say it again. I'm sorry.
The observer effect.
Yeah. I mean, in my meditation, I've been with transcendental meditation and Sri Ravi Shankar. So that gives my background.
Okay. Well, this is actually a physics, subatomic particle physics experiment that was done, which is, and the thing called the observer effect is that you can either know where something is headed, or you can know where it's been, right? But you can't know where it is in any given moment based on this until you introduce the observer effect, which what tends to happen. So the idea is that there's a field of energy in a state of absolute pure potentiality. Anything could happen. Basically, it's a probabilistic set of theorems could be run on what's likely to happen, but a consciousness, an awareness, an observer in a subatomic particle physics environment will cause one thing to occur. So in subatomic particle physics, and there's a fantastic movie for this. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's called What the Bleep Do We Know?
Oh yeah.
Right. And in that, Dr. Quantum talks about the double slit experiment. And you can find these, animations broken out on YouTube. So essentially what it is in this potentiality state of the field where all probabilities are equally possible and happening simultaneously. Matter is both a particle and a wave, both. So it shows up as an individual particle and as a wave simultaneously until there's an observer, and then it picks one, and usually picks particle when there's an observer. The observer influences the field through consciousness, which is more energy. And so on the spot, the universe has to make up its mind from being everything all at once to being one thing rather than another. And this is part of the subatomic particle makeup of how we actually make our world. Because what we believe to be true, we will create more of, right? What we think of, what we focus on expands. It's not just in our perception, it actually expands in our experience. And we individually can build a world based upon our negative thinking. Oh, this always happens to me. And just that statement holds the belief that it always happens to me, which means that I'm actually participating in the manifestation of the same thing recurring, rather than something different occurring. And I don't know if have you ever heard of the British entertainer, NLP master, hypnotist, Darren Brown?
No.
Okay, so it's DERREN. Also, a bunch of great stuff on YouTube. He did a test where they set up an experiment where they kind of tricked the whole village. So with his BBC television program and the help of a bunch of celebrities, they got a village to believe that a particular statue in the park adjacent to a cemetery was lucky. And that there was a little myth that if you rub the head of the dog, the statue, that it would transfer luck to you. And then they followed this for like a month. And the people who rubbed the head of the dog started having, quote, lucky events happen to them, which basically was the influence of their belief that they were lucky caused more positive events to happen in their awareness, and for them to come upon money, have better relationships, win contests, do all kinds of things. And then they had some folks who were very notably believers that they were unlucky. And they outed the project. And one of the people was a butcher who believed that he was particularly unlucky. And they got him to rub the head of the dog and all that. And he ended up winning the whole little lottery that they put on, which I think was like his whole life savings value, 20,000 pounds or something, because he changed his belief about whether he was lucky or not. And it was just, it was, it was like a tautology. It's like the belief in luck creates luck. The belief in unluckiness creates unluck, because luck isn't a thing. Probability is a thing. Luck is a superstitious belief. And that's what Darren's point was. But look at the impact it had on the people that believed it. It was all positive. It's just they weren't giving causal, they were not attaching causation to the right point. The cause was their belief and the actions that came as a consequence of it, not some statue in a garden.
I think you've given me enough for me to think about. But can we talk again? I would like to continue this, but not now.
Sure, absolutely.
Overloaded right now. For some reason, I know that Rehan wanted us to talk, and I kind of put it. I had so many people that he wanted me to talk to for a while that I lost track, and I don't want to say what I'm thinking. It happened by accident, because it didn't. It happened at the time it was supposed to happen. It's
Absolutely.
a very interesting conversation. I also have a show called Mindful with Carla and Friends, where we explore all of these things. And I'm wondering if you would be interested in being a part of it some week.
Absolutely. Absolutely. My personal experience went such that I felt out of touch with my community and my family when I was a child. I didn't feel particularly wanted. It was, an accidental birth while my parents were dating, or accidental pregnancy. And what ended up happening is I started reflecting on why are things the way they are, and are things the way they appear. And my discovery has shown me that they are clearly not how they appear many, many times, most of the time. Why are things the way they are? Largely, I think the habitual behavior of most of us, which when we actually take that time, not to fix ourselves, because we don't need fixing, but to sort of get a pair of corrective lenses so we can see more clearly, a lot of things change for the better really quickly. And without a tremendous amount of effort, a lot of things we used to think were difficult aren't. It all really has to do with our identity and whether we see ourselves as a limited self or not. I think that the Sadhguru was in interview. I'll have this be my last thing to say. Sadhguru was in an interview with a podcaster and who runs a podcast called the School of Greatness. And he said the greatest tragedy in the world is an empowered, limited identity. He said Hitler, a man whose name will hardly be spoken of, was an empowered, limited identity. He said that in the traditions of his country, in India, when children are raised, before they're given Western education or any traditional education, they're given a mantra.
Yeah.
And they're given the belief that they have an identity that is equal to the entire universe, that everything is them and they are everything, and that they have a responsibility to this. And the mantra helps reinforce the fact that they are not that. Then through Western education, they become an empowered individual, but with a consciousness of all things.
Makes a lot of sense.
Very different. Very well, and you know, think about some of the more challenging characters we have running around in the world. You know, they seem to have this empowered, limited belief that they are right, and they're right enough to be able to tell others what to do or how to do it or whether they should live or die. And I think that may have been true from the beginning. There is a high quality special effects system that we are gifted to have a rich experience of life, and we've been kind of reading it backwards, right? The instructions and ingredients are on the inside, not on the outside.
I'll tell a very quick story. When I first met Sri Sri Ravi Shankar about 6 months later, there was a snowstorm and I was stuck in the house where he was staying. And I remember him calling me to his room and he said, well, I want you to write about school. And he gave me 3 things he wanted me to write about. And one was the teacher belongs to you and you belong to the teacher. And there's really no separation. Number 2 was make a friend every day, because making a friend, you begin to accept the world better. And number 3 was make sure you laugh at your mistakes instead of taking them positively.
Yes.
And he said, every child needs to learn that. Now, I taught that to the students I had in my classrooms. You know, in very weird ways, I saw myself teaching that. And I think that is what our students need more than the education system we have put them in. And I've had people say to me, but Carla, they need to learn math and English. And yeah, that's true. But first we need to teach them human values. And when you teach them human values, you begin to teach them what the world is really about.
Well, there's a curious little factoid out there that I think you'll appreciate. There's a school of belief that we've been sold a bill of goods about this whole idea about the survival of the fittest, right? This so-called Darwinian viewpoint. Turns out Darwin didn't actually have that viewpoint. In The Origin of Species, the concept of the survival of the fittest is mentioned 3 times in the book. Uniquely, in curiously, the word love is used 140 times. But the survival of the fittest sold more books. So that's what they promoted.
But love is the most powerful.
It's the binding force.
Right.
It's not that there isn't a survival of the fittest in a contest of life or death. It's that most life is about living, which is done through collaboration and nurturing.
I want to thank you for tonight. I actually really needed it, and I was thinking, oh, maybe I should cancel it. I'm not in the mood. But I'm very happy we did this. Are there any last words you want to leave our audience with?
Well, just things are more possible than they appear. Faith, because we can create a better world, and it's right here, right now, in the offing as we speak, that's occurring. And I think Professor Pinker from Harvard has demonstrated that statistically, that there's fewer deaths and it's harder to die by gun violence than it has been at any other time. But that's not the way the news is told, and that's not the way certain politicians like to tell the story, because frightened people can't think and are disconnected from their higher values. If you look at Maslow's triangle, right, or his pyramid, the very top point, right, is basically self-actualization. And everywhere beneath that needs to have a certain level of support to it. So we need to have our basic creature needs taken care of. Once we hit about level 4, exploration comes in. So once we have all of our fundamental needs met and we feel more safe and secure, our desire to grow innately kicks in for almost all people. And there's actually something called the Dublin Miracle, which essentially came about as a consequence of investment in businesses in Dublin, which allowed a financial boom to occur where, for the first time in modern history, there was more abundance in Dublin than had ever been before. And suddenly and miraculously, without the British police getting better at their jobs, or the British military in their stance against the Irish, or supposed defense against the Irish, the Sinn Féin could not raise the money to support the IRA, so the bombings almost stopped completely. And the reason is because people were focused at the future and at their own life now, instead of focusing on resentments of the past. And this is one of the reasons why, political figures will cause campaigns of hate and fear to occur, so people will go to the next lowest level of values and do horrendous things to each other because they can control a mob through propaganda. But when we're actually looking towards our own expansion, we're more connected, more loving, more curious, more forgiving, more accepting, and we don't want to have anything to do with that stuff. It's only when we think we're threatened with death that we do that. So there is hope, but we have to take charge of our own lives to do that, to create that hope as a real thing in the world. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, we've gone a lot longer than I had ever expected to go. And actually, I do need to get off. But I want to thank you for speaking with me tonight. And I would
Absolutely.
like to have more conversations with you. And having said that, I want to remind everyone that this show is sponsored by the Institute of Peace, which is an organization Rehan has started to create peace with more conversation around the world. And as I always say, one conversation at a time. And with that, can we wave goodbye? And we'll see you
So
later.
long, farewell.